Nathan, how's it going?
I'm doing good. How are you, Dr. Jenny?
All right. So we have Nathan Rhea. Let him introduce the rest of his team from University of the Pacific. He is, sharing a screen and we'll be discussing predicting performance decline with heart rate variability in college age Valorant players. All right, I
Awesome.
hand it off to you. Let's go.
Thank you very much. So my name is Nathan Rhea. I'm a non-tenure track faculty member at the University of Pacific in Stockton, California. And today I'm going to be talking with you all about predicting performance decline with heart rate variability in college age Valorant players. I want to thank Dr. Jenny and everyone in the Esports Research Network team for allowing us to come here and talk about this work, as well as my collaborators, Robert Calvert, Jason Tran, and Iona Pascual, who put in a ton of work into this project. So excited to share what our findings were today. Let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today is we're going to briefly introduce our topic, do a brief review of the literature as well, talk about how that shaped our research question, our hypotheses, describe our methods briefly, talk about how we explored some of the data, looking at our correlations and validation processes, our primary results, some analyses and conclusions, share some recommendations for future work, as well as some of the limitations of what we did, because we had a pretty unique perspective on how to do our study. So without further ado, so our work is specifically focusing on the role that stress and tilt play in gameplay performance. For those that aren't familiar, tilt is a common experience for both casual and competitive players. It's often been described as a state of stress, frustration, and anger that typically results from a perceived sense of injustice that comes from a variety of different factors within the game. It could be teammates, yourself, um, and a suboptimal result that you feel like wasn't fair. And it often leads players to make poor decisions consecutively. It typically has a snowballing effect. And so we've been really focused on finding ways to describe this state from a physiological point of view. Its psychology and phenomenology has had more work in the past few years describing kind of how this typically relates to a player's experience, but there hasn't been much work yet looking at how this looks from a physiological perspective. So we were interested in using biometric indices like heart rate variability, or HRV for short, to track this physiological stress and potentially help inform players when their performance is declining or worsening, and then potentially entering a tilted state, which still needs some further defining. The reason why we liked HRV in particular is because it's a non-invasive measure of typically the body's stress response. So heart rate is the body's kind of natural beats per minute. So it's the average beats that occur by the heart over the course of a full minute. HRV is the variation in time between successive heartbeats. And that variability is a kind of reflection of the body's stress response. Typically, with more variation and kind of a higher HRV, you're seen to be in a more adaptive state and in calmer perspective. Lower HRV is seen as more stressful, more sympathetic, more fight or flight, and seen as a maladaptive stress response. So, as far as how HRV has been used up to this point in esports and gaming, it is somewhat limited up to this point. There have been some articles looking at HRV differences based on game genre, so things like action adventure games versus fighting games versus first-person shooters. There have been some studies investigating HRV during specific in-game events. So some works looking at specific League of Legends events and how HRV changes from before and after, and also looking at potential victory conditions too. So how HRV responds whether you win versus when you lose, and also comparing across different skill levels. But there hasn't been much work specifically looking at defining a person's performance based off their HRV response. Does higher or lower physiological stress indicate performance, and does it matter? And that's what really shaped our research question, which is how effectively can HRV predict declines in performance in casual and competitive college age Valorant players? Before we started doing this study, we actually talked to some students on campus about what were the most stressful games to play, and Valorant was always one of the top two or three that came up. It also has a unique setup that allows us to evaluate their stress response over the course of the game very conveniently. So a Valorant game match is determined by the number, or I guess how quickly one team can reach 13 wins or 13 round wins. And so you can individually evaluate each round of play's HRV response from a typically 30-second to 2-minute interval, which is just enough data to work with the valid HRV data. And so this is a very kind of unique way to investigate at specific points in time, how does, once again, stress change in Valorant players. So our hypotheses when looking at this research question, we assumed that higher HRV or bringing a calmer state would result in better gameplay performance. Typically assume when players are calmer, more controlled, more conservative, they're typically going to make better decisions. As far as how we defined performance, that was kind of the biggest hurdle for us to overcome. We didn't want to rely just on counting stats because they didn't always tell the full picture about performance, especially in a game like Valorant, where every player typically has a different role within a team context. And so we'll dive into how we kind of develop these criteria on the next slide. But the three criteria we developed specifically for our evaluations were game sense, which is specifically strategic decision making based off their agent type and the situation that the team is currently in, whether they're defending versus on the offensive. Successful utility usage, that includes the buy phase. So which equipment that they're purchasing, whether or not they're deploying it correctly or at the right time. And then risk. How risky is their play? Ideally, lower risk typically yields more consistent results. And so we thought risky play was another kind of optimal factor to look at when evaluating performance on a round-to-round basis. So in performing this study, we had three primary phases. The first was developing what we called an expert panel. So we had two experienced Valorant players that also spectate consistently too. So they have kind of that both player and spectator perspective. And me, the principal investigator, both created this focus group to establish what this criteria would look like based off each player's role, agent type, etc. And so we had a couple of lengthy conversations trying to establish what these performance criteria should look like. And that's where we came up with game sense, utility, and risk. Each of those three different metrics were scored on a 1 to 3 point scale. And that's kind of how we started as far as developing that criteria. After that phase, we started collecting data. So we recorded 23 different Valorant players' games while tracking HRV using a Polar H10 heart rate monitor chest strap. One of the reasons I'm thinking about HRV is such a good metric for HRV or esports stress is that it doesn't actually inhibit their ability to play the game. A lot of other biometric indices require things that might distract them from play or make it difficult to wear. And a chest strap typically doesn't get in the way of their ability to perform as they usually would. After we record each of their games, we would send the screen recording to the expert panel where they would then do a blind evaluation of each individual's game. So on every single recording, they'd watch each individual round and then make notes and then provide an overall evaluation score on their game sense, utility, and level of risk. They would then come together, the two of them, and create a consensus evaluation. So each video was watched at least twice with deliberate notes being taken and a lot of time going into creating what we considered a fairly objective judgment of their play on those three metrics that we created. And that led us to our data. So the first step after collecting all this data and starting to analyze it was starting to explore kind of and try and validate those different gameplay indices that we created. So we wanted to see strong correlations between things like game sense, utility, and then ideally outcomes within the game like winning the round, as well as things like risk. So what we found was that game sense, utility, and then we called this kind of like our gameplay composite score. So the average score across those three indices, just kind of the gameplay mean. And each of those shared strong positive correlations. And overall gameplay also had a positive correlation with winning. So typically when players made better decisions, they often won their round, or at least fairly frequently. But as you'll notice here, that correlation score, that 0.322, is lower than the others, which also reflects how sometimes players can make good decisions and still lose, which is inherently true. So that context is kind of accounted for when looking at their performance. What's interesting is that risk did not have a strong relationship at all with game sense or utility, but it did with the overall gameplay score. So when players played safer, they typically played better overall. And there also was typically a small positive relationship with safer play and winning, which we also thought was interesting too, because sometimes players can play risky and they can get lucky, or they can play too conservative and also not win. So risk does kind of play an interesting role in modulating how we evaluate performance. We also wanted to validate that our HRV data actually was clean. And so we did log transform all of our HRV data to make sure we accounted for the individual variations in HRV data. Everyone's HRV is very different based off things like their body composition, their height, their gender, time of day, etc. And so we try to normalize the data as much as we could to account for some of these differences. We expected to see strong correlations between what we call the time domain and frequency domain measures. So things like root mean square successive differences, high frequency power being frequency domain, and we did. So all of our HRV data did correlate strongly, as well as changes in HRV from a round-to-round basis, which is another important factor to look at when trying to measure the stress response. How much did their HRV increase or decrease from the previous round? All those correlations are positive, showing us that the data that we got looks pretty good. And that let us start looking at how did HRV relate to play. What's interesting is that we actually found a weak negative correlation between HRV and all of our typical gameplay indices. So game sense, utility, and overall gameplay each had weak negative correlations with HRV. So when a person's HRV was higher, their play was actually a little bit worse, which is fascinating because we assumed it would be the opposite. And that also held true for our frequency domain metrics as well. No relationship existed though between HRV and risk, which we also thought was kind of an interesting tidbit. Seems like risk and kind of how safe you play with is very kind of variable, which kind of makes sense logically that it wouldn't always be consistent since it's a less controllable factor. Stronger relationships existed between changes in HRV and gameplay as well. So we saw stronger negative correlations between how much a person's HRV increased or decreased per round and their game sense, their utility, and then that gameplay average across those three different scores. And that also held true for our frequency domain metrics as well as our time, which shows alignment between the HRV data. It didn't just hold true for one, it held true for both, which is fascinating once again. So as a player's HRV went up from the previous round, their play typically worsened. So once we kind of confirmed some of these assumptions, we managed to develop some mixed effect models. The challenge with our study design is our data was pretty messy. Because every Valorant game can end in a different number of rounds, we had unequal number of rounds for almost every single participant, which means that traditional linear regression models don't work. Additionally, we don't have independent observations because we have a big old pool of data. So we had over like 446 rounds, but then we had 23 people. And so we had to do some interesting stats to make this all work, but linear mixed effects models can account for unequal repeated measures as well as not independent observations. And so this managed to work out for us. It also let us account for the random variance on a subject level as well. What we found in this regression model is that as HRV increased or was higher from a round-to-round basis, it typically, once again, was associated with lower game sense, lower utility, and then lower average play across those three different indices. So if a player's HRV was higher, they played a little bit worse, but not significantly worse in a way that was, necessarily alarming. What was stronger relationship was still, once again, the changes in HRV across rounds. You'll see in that kind of bar graph on the side there, as a player's gameplay improved based off our scale, HRV significantly lowered from a round-to-round basis. So if a player's HRV increased from the previous round, so they're entering a calmer state, they're actually playing worse according to our scale. And the estimated effect is actually somewhat significant since it's only on a 1 to 3 point scale. For example, if someone's HRV increases on a 1 point scale, their estimated utility decreases almost half a point, which is fairly significant, especially if that compounds from a round-to-round basis. So we thought that was a very interesting finding because once again, you'd assume that when players are calmer, they're going to make better decisions. And that leads to some of our different analyses and conclusions that we drew from this study. So what we can say confidently is that there is a significant relationship between HRV and play, but it doesn't paint the full picture. It doesn't account for enough of the variance to say confidently that we can predict someone's play consistently every single time using just HRV. But what we can start to conclude, or at least hypothesize is this idea of a potential physiological, what we call disengagement when playing poorly. It's something I noticed when I was actually watching each player play in real time while we're tracking their HRV. Often when players would start to play poorly or they had a poor outcome, they would kind of push themselves away from the desk, take a deep breath, and kind of get like that frustrated look in their eyes of like they have to keep playing, but they don't want to. And so the decisions become a bit more risky. They start kind of using their abilities, maybe not in the most successful strategies. They kind of go outside the team norms or what's expected for their role. And then their HRV actually is going up, at least in theory, because they care less. They're not as the kids would say, locked into what's happening within the game. They're actually checking out of it a little bit, which is fascinating. But other factors need to be included to once again improve the accuracy of these predictions and hopefully strengthen this relationship between physiological stress and a player's performance, which leads to our recommendations for future work. So we advocate for incorporating other biomarkers and factors to try and improve these models. Some ideas we had were things like ocular tracking for focus and attention, mood recognition technology to capture some of the different kind of emotive aspects of someone's psychological and physiological state, see if there's a relationship between the two. Short-term self-report measures to kind of, incorporate player voice in that assessment as well. And then one more invasive kind of biomarker to look at is something like salivary cortisol. It's the body's primary stress hormone, but it's typically more difficult to track once again in real time. We also want to try and collaborate more with psychological researchers to try and once again bridge that gap between the psychology of tilt and then the physiology of it as well, and see if we can better define it using both together in tandem. Because once again, it seems like it's the stress response is very variable depending on the player's experience. We also advocate for continuing to investigate specific in-game events. One of the strengths of our study, we felt, was that we were able to capture each individual round stress response and not just looking at the full match. So we captured more of the context behind someone's performance and not just the kind of larger outcome over the course of what can be 30 minutes to an hour worth of gameplay and a lot of ups and downs regarding their performance. And then also trying to find ways to standardize performance measures to improve replicability of these types of studies. One limitation I'll address the next slide is that we feel like there is an obvious level of subjectivity to how we judged performance, but we also feel like going once again back to counting stats isn't always the most effective reflection of their performance. And it's important to capture more of the nuance when we're evaluating how well someone is playing, because it doesn't always show up kind of in the outcome at the end using those different stats. The primary limitations that we found, while we had a large number of rounds to evaluate, which is great, we had a small sample of players, only 23. And so it's not always like a representative sample of kind of the larger esports community of Valorant players. We had a pretty wide variety of skill levels, but that also, once again, isn't context specific. So we had players as high ranked as Immortal. We had a couple bronze players and everything in between. I'm sure that we'd probably receive different data if we had kind of professional players versus kind of more the casual or kind of amateur side that we kind of captured as well. Another thing too was that players only played a single match. That isn't typical for like a common Valorant player. They're usually playing 2 to 4 matches in a row. It might give us more authentic data that represents kind of their typical experience when playing. And then going back to the previous kind of note on our recommendations, trying to standardize performance metrics in the future, finding ways to kind of strengthen our evaluations of this side of performance and decision making to make it as objective as possible for the future. So these are our references. I want to thank my collaborators again. And then if you have any questions, I'll obviously take them. And then this is my email as well. I'm also on LinkedIn, didn't include a QR code, but would love to connect with people and talk about this work and anything else people are interested in. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Nathan, did you want me to read the questions to you or throw them into the Zoom chat?
Preferably if you can read them, that would be great.
All right. First question, have you found any evidence regarding physical fitness levels and esports performance?
Not yet. It's on the docket. So our esports research program here at Pacific is kind of in its infancy. It's starting to grow. This is actually our first study that we're starting to investigate these factors. But we're also getting our own gaming rig within our building soon, which means more opportunities for more work like this and potentially looking at things like VO2 max since we have a metabolic cart in our building. And so, yes and no. Hopefully soon.
All right. Dr. Robbie Mack asks, have you considered investigating the impact of specific in-game events on heart rate variability opposed to investigating rounds as a whole?
Yes, and that's actually something that we've planned on doing in the future with this current data set because we do still have the recordings and we can look back at specific things like if we're looking at Valorant, for example, different strategies that different teams use, like during a hard push, for example, what did their stress response look like during that time period, when they're on defense versus offense, etc. Um, I also think that stress response is so dependent on the game being played because Valorant, for example, could look a lot different than League versus Rocket League versus Overwatch. And so we feel like stress response is very context specific. And so we want to try and investigate these things more thoroughly. It also takes a long time because my panel put in like probably over 200 hours of watching these people play. So.
Ooh, that is a lot. Another question. Would on-screen heart rate be helpful or hurt player performance? Would this be helpful at all? As you probably know, Garmin made an esports watch that did this.
Yeah, we're not sure yet. I think that's kind of in the works. We're trying to see how effective things like HRV and heart rate are actually at predicting performance. Like, because like we found sometimes when like at least based on our sample, when players were having a higher stress response, they were actually playing better. And so is it better to have someone have that biofeedback available? And let's say their heart rate's lower or their HRV is lower and they say, okay, I got to get more stressed. Is that necessarily a good thing, right? So I think we need more information before we can confidently say that it's an effective tool to have available to players at all times. I think we just need more data, but it's interesting though. It's kind of why we want to lead this eventually kind of at the finish line is can we use this as a biofeedback tool to help improve real-time play?
Um, what type of controls did you have for, caffeine, which can impact heart rate and those types of things that may impact your data in relation to what your measures specific to this study?
Yeah, and I knew this question was coming too because HRV is such a noisy variable, which once again leans to the why it probably has such a small like percentage when it comes to its variance. The correlation is still not super strong yet. We did our best to try and inform players to not consume, caffeine, not eat a couple hours before their appointment. It was more or less the honor system. We check in with them. They'd say they do it. If they didn't, they were turned away. We also try to record at roughly the same time of day for everyone too, because HRV can look a lot different in morning and night. So we played typically between 1 and 4 p.m. on weekdays. So did our best to, but it's hard to control for that 100% because people can have said they didn't have anything to drink that was caffeinated, but they had a Red Bull 30 minutes ago. So
Which they probably did.
yeah.
I'm joking. All right. I do not see any other questions in the chat. Oh, and one just came in. Love this talk. Logged on from a watch party to say that from Sparkly Piggy. All right.
I love the name too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably Tobias's alter ego. Uh, here's another question. Is your collaborator Jason Tran, former LCS pro, Wild Turtle?
I have no idea.
We're digging deep now.
Oh yeah. No, it's not. It's not. Jason was not a former pro, but I'm sure he would take the compliment if he'd probably say he was. So
Okay. All right. Maybe you just don't know.
that's true. Maybe I got to get to know Jason better. But
All right. Any other final last words before we transition to the next speaker?
no, I'm just thank you again for the opportunity. It's great to share this work. It took a lot of time, and so we're proud to kind of hopefully start this conversation around building biofeedback tools for players. So thank you again.
Is this research published, or is it in the works, or what's the
In the
status?
works, in the
Okay.
works. So trying to develop a manuscript here soon. So
Yeah, that's the next step, the next dreaded academic step.
always.
All right, thanks, Nathan. If you can stop sharing your screen, and we're going to get set up for Slippery Rock University's last presentation for this streaming hub for today, at least. We will be back tomorrow. And do not go away, because the University of UNSW Sydney will be hosting after us. But our next presenter is Enzo from the University of Tsukuba. The presentation is titled Systematic Review of Anxiety Indicators, Coping Mechanisms and Stress Levels in Esports Athletes. So give us a second and we will get Enzo.